So today we're digging into a bit of a political mystery. During Poland's most recent election, something pretty shocking happened. An entire generation just seemed to vanish from the polls. We're going to break down why Poland's youth stayed home and what it might mean for the future of democracy. Okay, let's get right into it.
And this right here, this is the central question we're tackling. Because, when the youngest voters, the people who are literally the future of the country, decide to sit out an election, it's way more than just a statistic. It's a message. And our job is to figure out what that message is.
All right, so let's set the scene. It's election night. The first results start rolling in, and at first glance, the big picture seems pretty normal. But as analysts started digging deeper into the data, a really unsettling trend began to surface.
That's right. The numbers for older and middle-aged voters, they were strong, totally consistent with previous elections. They showed up. But when the spotlight turned to the youngest demographic, well, the story changed completely. It was almost like a whole chunk of the electorate just decided to become invisible. And this is the number that stopped everyone in their tracks. Fewer than 35% of eligible Polish voters under the age of 25 actually cast a ballot. We're not talking about a small dip here. This was a collapse. I mean, let that sink in for a second. Nearly 2 out of every 3 young people stayed home.
And this chart really puts the scale of the problem into perspective. On one side, you've got the youth turnout, barely clearing a third. And on the other, turnout for older adults is way up there, over 60%. This isn't just a gap, it's a chasm, a huge generational divide that pretty much defined this entire election.
So no surprise, experts and the media very quickly started calling this a turnout crisis. It blew up into a national conversation, right? You had people blaming everything from apathy to a broken education system. But just giving it a label doesn't really explain what's going on. For that, we've got to look even closer at the numbers.
But here's where it gets more nuanced. This collapse wasn't uniform across the board. The data actually shows some really clear patterns. Young people in big cities like Warsaw, for instance, voted at a higher rate, closer to 40%. But out in rural areas, that number plummeted to 25% or even less. We also saw a gender gap, with young women being a bit more likely to vote than young men. And education level mattered too. It tells us that things like being in an urban center or having higher education helped, but the vast majority still felt left out of the process. All right, so we've pretty much established the what. We know what happened. Now we're getting into the much more complicated question, why? And based on a ton of surveys and analysis, it seems to boil down to 4 key motives that explain this massive abstention. So we're going to break these down one by one. First, a fundamental lack of trust in the whole system. Second, a major digital disconnect between politicians and young voters. Third, this pervasive feeling that, hey, nothing's ever going to change anyway. And finally, the heavy weight of economic pressure. Okay, let's start with trust, or maybe the total lack of it. This number is just staggering. 7 out of 10 young Poles surveyed said they do not trust politicians to act in their best interests. I mean, when you have that level of deep-seated cynicism, the whole act of voting can start to feel completely pointless. Next up, this digital disconnect. This generation literally lives online, right? On platforms like TikTok and Instagram. And yet, most of the political campaigns were still stuck in the past, running these old-school TV ads. And the stuff young people did see on their social feeds, it wasn't thoughtful policy discussion. It was mostly just clips of politicians yelling at each other. The message just wasn't landing. And this quote, man, it just captures that third reason perfectly. This deep sense of futility. So many young people felt like they were trapped in a political system that was just stagnant and totally unresponsive. To them, it didn't really matter who they voted for because the outcome felt like it was already decided. The faces and the problems always seemed to be exactly the same. And finally, we get to the crushing reality of economic strain. This quote just gets right to the heart of it. For a lot of young Poles who are struggling with insane rent, low wages, and a shaky job market, just getting through the day-to-day is a battle. Abstract ideas like democracy can feel like a luxury they just can't afford to worry about. Now, it's really important to understand that this isn't just about one election cycle. What we're actually seeing here is evidence of a much bigger cultural shift in how an entire generation thinks about civic duty and political engagement. So here's the paradox. This generation isn't apathetic at all. They are deeply, deeply engaged in the issues they care about. Things like climate change, social justice, free speech, but their activism just looks different. They're signing online petitions, they're organizing on social media, they're showing up for protests. For a lot of them, these actions feel way more direct and impactful than the slow and often frustrating process of traditional voting.
And, Poland isn't alone in this. We're seeing similar trends of declining youth turnout in countries like Germany and Hungary. But, and this is a big but, it's not some irreversible fate. You look at countries like Finland and Spain, and they've actually seen a rise in youth engagement. Why? Mostly because of targeted digital outreach and policies that speak directly to what young people are worried about. It just goes to show this problem can be fixed.
So this brings us to the ultimate question, right? Okay, so young people didn't vote. But in the grand scheme of things, did it actually make a difference? Well, the answer is a lot bigger than you might think. The answer is a huge, emphatic yes. Data modeling suggests that if youth turnout had just been higher, opposition parties could have picked up an extra 3 to 5 seats in parliament. Now, that might not sound like a huge number, but in a really tight political race, it's everything. And this is where we see the real-world consequences. Those missing votes weren't just symbolic. They had a direct, tangible impact on the balance of power in the country. They could have shifted coalitions and completely altered Poland's political trajectory for years to come. The absence of young voters actively reshaped the political map. So, what can we learn from this whole turnout crisis? The takeaways are pretty clear, not just for Poland, but for any democracy that's facing a similar challenge. Political education has to start way earlier. Campaigns have to learn to speak the digital language of young people. They need to show a clear line between voting and real-life impact. And most importantly, they have to start the long, hard work of rebuilding trust. So, if we circle all the way back to our original mystery, the verdict is in. The collapse in youth turnout wasn't a sign of apathy or ignorance. It was a cry of frustration. It came from a generation that feels disconnected, ignored, and completely unheard by the political establishment. It was a silent protest, staged not out in the streets, but from their own homes. And that leaves us with this final, critical question. Every generation eventually finds its political voice. History shows us that time and time again. But for this generation, in Poland and everywhere else, the great unknown is where they'll choose to use that voice. Will they be brought back into the fold of traditional democracy, or will they forge a completely new path for activism, one that exists entirely outside of the ballot box? The answer to that is going to define our future.